Every day when you walk to work, you are literally treading on history. There are hundreds of thousands of objects buried underneath the city. Now, come to the Thames and things get a bit different. Each time the tide comes in and out, it reveals new objects. You might find a Roman vase or a clay pipe dropped by a debauched Elizabethan courtier. These are random clues left for us by Londoners from the past, things that can short-circuit us straight into their lives. The Thames is full of surprises, but its best kept secret, it never used to be here at all. This familiar view of the Thames Valley looked very different 500,000 years ago. For a start, Britain was still connected to continental Europe, and the river's distant ancestor flowed much further north than it does today. From near what is now Marlow, it passed through modern-day Watford, St Albans and Colchester, and reached today's coastline somewhere near Clacton. It was the Ice Age that changed everything. Glaciers advancing from the polar region reached the northern suburbs of modern London and blocked the original river. It was forced southwards into a watercourse much more like the one we know today. Later, climate temperatures rose, and with the new heat came new life. So, the scene was set for the very first Londoners to make their entrance. And believe it or not, this is one of the spots they chose to call home. We know there was an early settlement here because nearly 300,000 years ago, somebody left something behind. This. It's a hand axe, beautifully carved from flint, and it was probably used to skin wild animals, horses or even mammoths maybe. It was dug up here in Glasshouse Street, just off Piccadilly Circus, when they were building the Regent Palace Hotel. It's evidence of early human life bang in the heart of modern London. But life not quite as we know it.
Well, Swanscombe Woman, I think without fear of contradiction, is probably the first Londoner, if you like, the first true Londoner.
3 parts of her skull were found in a gravel pit near Dartford.
She dates to the period around about 400,000 years ago and represents a form of human that is ancestral to us. She's not anatomically a modern person.
From other examples found elsewhere in Europe, archaeologists could piece together a picture of Swanscombe Woman's lifestyle.
She would have lived a fairly hard life. It would have been fairly harsh. We don't really know whether these people wore clothes, but we can be fairly clear that they would have been cooperating with each other in small groups, perhaps 20 to 50 strong, to scavenge and hunt animal game along the river banks.
Apparently primitive, the flint axes Swanscombe Woman and her comrades used were actually perfect for delicate tasks like skinning game. And they reveal a certain sophistication among these early Londoners.
Put yourself perhaps in the position of a modern sculptor who, presented with a block of stone, has to try and visualise the end product in that block of stone and work towards it. And I think that's what these ancient flint knappers were having to do. They were finding these large river gravel cobbles and having to work them down into a form that they'd already themselves, in their mind, predetermined. So in a way, working a hand axe, achieving that very nice symmetrical form was a little bit like playing stone chess. You have to think 5 or 6 moves ahead of yourself and have a very clear end view in mind.
Alongside the Piccadilly axes, archaeologists found animal remains, including this mammoth tusk. Central London was home to some pretty exotic wildlife.
The sort of animals that we're talking about, I think, many of them now extinct, include things like straight-tusked elephant, woolly mammoth, woolly rhino. Even in certain of the sites, we've got traces of macaque monkey, Very exotic species to us today, but very typical, the sort of species that Swanscombe Woman would have shared her landscape with.
Land beneath Heathrow Airport was first settled around 40,000 years ago. Anatomically, these were people like us, modern humans, who came and went with climate changes. But eventually, when the last ice age retreated, they stayed. The skull of a wolf links us to these first permanent settlers in the London area. It was found with Shepperton Woman, a rare and mysterious burial near the Thames in West London. Nearby, deliberately buried, were antler tools, other bones, and an intricately decorated bowl, clues to how our ancestors lived some 5,000 years ago.
We know that the predominant species was cattle, and had sheep and goats, and some pig as well. They were essentially farming cattle and things like that. And there was a lot of hunting elements. They were hunting red deer and roe deer in the surrounding countryside, which is a mix of cleared areas and scrubby woodland. And there's also suggestions that they excarnated their dead. That is, like in places in India today, they put their dead on a raised platform perhaps, and let the birds eat away the flesh, or let it rot up there, and only when they were bones did they bury them. It's a very curious aspect of that early lifestyles in the London area.
When you get up close to this powerful, murky water, you can understand why there's always been such a mystery around the Thames. Some of the most extraordinary prehistoric objects that we have been turned up from the riverbed, and this is no coincidence. Our ancient ancestors worshipped the river as one of their gods.
An axe head made of jadeite from the Western Alps, polished for days. A beautiful object, but useless as a tool. Found in the river, a carefully made bronze-bound wooden tankard, apparently tossed in the Thames. The Battersea Shield, not lost, but placed in the water.
The quite deliberate destruction of large quantities of valuable objects to gain basically peer prestige. You are able to demonstrate to your peers that you are so wealthy you can afford to give this stuff to the river. It's a bit like standing on a street corner burning a bundle of tenors, that sort of idea, or a rock star driving a white Rolls Royce into a swimming pool. You do it because you can.
The chiefs of settlements like this led pilgrimages to the river to placate the gods and demonstrate their own status.
This is Caesar's camp on Wimbledon Common, but in fact it predates Caesar by about 700 years. It was probably built by a local ruler as a defendable hilltop settlement, and you can imagine ancient Britons trudging up here to bring their grain and skins and meat in return for his patronage and protection. At a time of crisis, it would have been a refuge, and for ancient Britons living in what's now Greater London, a very real crisis was looming: the Roman Empire.
AD 43, and the Romans invade Britain with a colossal army of 40,000 men. They sweep up through Kent, meeting little opposition, then fight and win a pitched battle near Rochester.
Fighting in the ancient world was brutal. When it came down to it, it was the two individuals face to face. It would have been bashing and crashing and trying to disable your opponent as quickly as possible. It was very noisy, very smelly, very scary.
funny to think that in theory, London could have ended up anywhere along the river. But the Romans chose the north bank to found the town that would be called Londinium for very good reasons. Over there were warring tribes that needed to be contained. And 2,000 years ago, this was the tidal head of the river, the furthest point where cargo-laden boats could easily navigate. It was also, though, narrow enough to actually throw a bridge across. Much of this landscape would have been flooded marshes, but over there was a gravel plateau, perfect for the firm foundations of a city.
Strangely enough, the origins of London's name have been lost. But one theory is that it comes from Lo Wanida, an ancient word meaning the place where the river floods. It certainly fits the scene 2,000 years ago.
One of the things it's very difficult to imagine about London in the past was how completely different the river was. And I know, Gustav Milne, you've been spending some time looking at Roman London. So what would this area have been like under the Romans?
When the Romans arrived, this river was completely different. If you look behind me here, for example, that grey building is actually standing on the Roman riverbank beyond Lower Thames Street. And on the south bank, beyond the front line, we have the building with the steam coming out, where Guy's Hospital is. That gives you the other side of the river. So it was up to 1 kilometre wide in some places.
Soon there was a bustling trading post. But before Londinium could truly establish itself, it nearly perished in infancy. Disaffected tribes, led by Queen Boudica, rose in revolt, and Londinium was a prime target.
We have large amounts of archaeological evidence to show the destruction of the town, the Boudiccan fire horizon, as we commonly call it.
Eventually, the Romans annihilated the rebels, and Londinium wouldn't lie down. By the end of the 1st century, it was boom time. There was a huge forum for meetings, markets and offices, a basilica for law and administration. Londinium was capital of Roman Britain, and trade with an empire bigger than today's European Union was at its heart. The port was vital.
So how big were the wharves?
Well, this area gives you a very good idea about the Roman quay. This would be the actual quayside itself, so all that is the river with the boats lined up here. And these buildings here actually give you a very good impression of the warehouses themselves. They'd all be about 5 metres wide, which is about the width of those 2 bays. And it was into these bays that those cargoes would be stowed.
And what exactly were the kinds of cargoes that were coming, presumably from all over the empire?
Absolutely. Wine from all over the Roman world. You'll be getting fish sauce. Fish sauce, believe it or not, was incredibly popular in the Roman period, so they needed lots of it.
It must have smelled terrible, though.
Well, especially if you dropped a pot of it, it would. And you can imagine slippery gangplanks and things, all sorts of cargoes would get dropped.
And presumably it was spectacularly cosmopolitan as well, because you must have had people from Africa, from Turkey, from France,
You'd
bringing
get
all the goods.
an awful bundle of languages here, so there must have been quite a few arguments. You've got the Celts speaking Celtic, as it were, and you've got the Romans talking in Latin, giving orders, and some of the merchants may well have been Greek. So it would be very cosmopolitan and presumably quite argumentative. You know what these Italians are like. So you can imagine the hustle and bustle here, trying to get these cargoes in, trying to load the ships up, trying to sell a few slaves here, the hunting dogs gathering here, they were a famous export, and all the grain. We're trying to get all the grain out to feed the Rhine army and bringing all the olive oil in and the wine in to feed the Britons.
And if you say some of the stuff was dropped, has any of it survived?
Amazingly, that's how we know about all these cargoes, because we're looking at all the breakages and we study the breakages and we can build up this great picture of the port. This was pottery which was made in France, and this is high quality tableware.
So you say it's high quality tableware, but how do you know that? What are the distinguishing marks?
You can see from the beautiful gloss and also from the decoration which you've got on the lip of this particular bowl here.
That's beautiful. So it looks like it's kind of squeezed on in relief.
It is. It's like icing on a cake. It's exactly the same technique, and this has been a nice round bowl. and the slip is put on by dipping it, the shine, the gloss, by dipping it into a solution, and they hold it with their hands and dip it in. And you can actually see the fingerprints of the French potter who made this 2,000 years ago. That's his actual thumbprint. You can hold his actual thumbprint there.
That's fantastic. What a find.
It was in shops like these, reconstructed at the Museum of London from archaeological evidence, that goods from home and abroad were sold.
So here I am, actually inside an authentic Roman street. Now, if I were a Roman slave girl, or even a highly bred Roman matron, I'd have come and bought my bread from the baker, because of course you didn't have ovens in the house in those days. If I was feeling particularly flush, I might have purchased one of these beautiful bowls. This is imported Samian ware from France. Fantastic green glaze. And after a frenetic day's shopping, I may have settled down with a flagon of wine and a game which is pretty much like a 2,000-year-old version of backgammon, Ludus Duodecim Scriptorum.
Along the main roads of the town there were sort of shops and houses, and these shops would have been open fronted, a bit like in the Wild West, where you get the timber houses, the general store opening onto the sort of wooden pavement, the wooden boardwalk.
And everywhere, the hurly-burly, in-a-hurry atmosphere of a thriving cosmopolitan town. The city wall was designed to be a stark reminder of Roman power at a time when rival claims to the empire's throne caused civil war, as well as rebellious rumblings in Britain.
It was built a bit like cavity walling today, in that you had two rows of very neat squared blocks. I mean, you've got some here that we can look at here, very carefully squared off by masons, and then filled them in with rubble and mortar infill. So it took in all over 1 million of these squared blocks of stone. So it really was a major undertaking.
When it was completed, it was 2 miles long, covering an area of nearly 330 acres. Most of this is medieval rebuild, but originally it was 6 metres tall and nearly 3 metres deep at the base. This was something built to last, and it did, providing defence for the city for nearly 14 centuries.
I cursed Tretia Maria and her life and mind and memory and liver and lungs mixed up together, and her words, thoughts and memory. Thus may she be unable to speak what things are concealed.
Scratched on fragments of lead, curses aimed by Roman Londoners at their enemies, the equivalent of sticking pins in a voodoo doll. Some were written backwards to increase their potency. And then you threw them in the river. Roman Londoners took the likes of Neptune, Mars and Apollo very seriously indeed.
People were largely in awe of these gods. They were fearful of these gods. A great ancient historian called Boulston once described these gods as similar to landlords, the sort of people where you would want to pay your rent when it was due and exactly the right amount when it was due. But the last thing you wanted was these people to come around and visit you. These people were in fear of these gods. These gods controlled everything.
But around this time, other deities were beginning to compete. The mysterious all-male cult who worshipped Mithras thrived for a while, with its strange rituals involving animal costumes and secrecy. And in 313 AD, the Emperor Constantine made Christianity the empire's official religion, and before long, the Christian church had arrived in Londinium. Religion then was central to the lives of Roman Londoners. But it certainly didn't stop them having fun.
There would have been likely to have been boxing contests, athletic contests, even acrobats, and we do have a leather bikini worn by a young female that we think possibly came from an acrobat. But they would have had other forms of entertainment. They enjoyed music, and we do have sort of remains of musical pipes, panpipes, those sorts of things. So they enjoyed music, but they enjoyed board games and betting most of all. So they used to like playing with dice, and in fact the Emperor Hadrian had to ban betting on dice because it was getting so bad. People were actually losing their livelihoods and their fortunes by betting on dice.
But for fun on a grand scale, you couldn't beat the amphitheatre, which was built where the Guildhall now stands in the city.
This line of black slate marks the walls of the amphitheatre, and inside you could have seated an incredible 7,000 people. Now that's almost the entire population of Londinium at the time. On high days and holy days, when troops of gladiators arrived, the atmosphere must have been electric and almost as noisy as it is today in the heart of London, with builders everywhere. There were fights between men, there were combats between women, and there were bloody battles with wild animals. And mind you, if you came expecting a fight to the death, you could well have been disappointed. The action here was very, very heavily stage managed. This was showbiz.
Around 400 AD, danger from barbarians threatened Rome itself, and the legions were withdrawn. Londinium went into steep decline.
We have something in archaeology, and particularly London archaeology, called dark earth, which is sometimes quite thick, and it is a black earth. And it's there because plants and trees were growing and leaves were falling and decaying. It's a natural level. And it tells us that when the Romans went, they really did go, and London became a true ghost town. Trees and bushes and herbs grew up through the streets, through the layers where the houses were, and it became a ghost town. And it would have been a very eerie and evocative place to come to.
Londinium may have disappeared as a physical reality, but it never disappeared from people's minds. It was always there as an inspiration, an ideal, a memory, a history, and a sort of vision of the future. I mean, insofar as 16th, 17th, 18th century Londoners thought of themselves as the bearers of authority, as the continuers of culture, then it was Rome they looked back to. It was no accident that Shakespeare wrote Julius Caesar and Antony. It was no accident that the 18th century saw itself as an Augustan age. The city meant civilization, and that meant Rome.
We don't know much about the final days of Londinium. The evidence there is suggests a slow decline and abandonment rather than some kind of cataclysmic destruction. The bridge was allowed to fall into disrepair. The stones that made up the beautiful civic buildings slowly crumbled. The walls were still standing, but there was no one left inside to protect. Once the Roman legionaries had gone and trade had dried up because of a shrinking empire, the local population just seemed to lose the need for a city. After 400 years of vibrant, cultural, cosmopolitan life, the Dark Ages were about to begin.